and the sensitivity is 800 to 3200, while the other cameras, I'll like to talk about the sensitivity in a second. So all the images start with the sensor, so let's have a few details on the F5 and F55. The design, the physical size, as well as the general characteristics are identical. But as I mentioned, there's a different readout. The F5 is using a so-called rolling shutter, which is commonly used. It's used on array cameras, on Canon cameras, on Sony cameras. And that's a very efficient way of reading out the sensor, but it has some downsides. The advantage of that is you're actually gaining sensitivity. So the F5 is rated at ISO 2000 native, while the frame image scan F55 gets a little bit down. It's 2/3 of a stop below the F5, and that's due to the fact there is additional electronics on the sensor, making it able to read out an image at one time and not in a sequential readout as the rolling shutter does. So that's why it's a bit slower. But it gives you something. I'll explain that. Just have a look at the F65. I mentioned it's a bit more photosites on that chip. So it's 20 million photosites on that sensor. So there is a big difference, and you can see that if you do visual effects work or reframing, you can see differences in that resolution. It's a very future-proof approach to have an imager like that, because you can drive all the resolutions out of one recording. So you can do 2K, 4K, and even higher if you want to. I mentioned already that the aspect ratio is a bit weird, so don't be scared. You can still do your 16:9, your 178, or your 185, and especially if you do CinemaScope style, like 239:1, you can use it with spheric lenses, and you of course use the full width of the sensor. If you want to do anamorphic, you can, but then you have to crop left and right, and therefore you have a little change in the angle of view. So it's because the sensor is not a 4:3 sensor by definition. This is an image of a really bad rolling shutter stills camera. It's actually an old iPhone camera. I took it out of a window of a train on my way to the Lillehammer University. And when I looked at that image, I said, what happened? I mean, the train was obviously driving very fast. No, not even very fast, just driving next to that tree. And the readout started here, and the tree was there. But until it finished the readout, the tree was already here. The tree didn't look like that. So that's a bad example of rolling shutter. Of course, all the cameras that you use in a professional environment, they have a lot better performance than this. But to explain what is going on a rolling shutter, I like this example. I try to reproduce the differences between an F5 and an F55. Might not be obvious, but I try to explain it to you. So there's a flash on a stills camera, and this is an F5 camera, and I just flashed into the lens, so you can see the flash is only up to here, and the bottom part, there's no flash. That's because of the readout of the sensor. Now this is the global shutter of the frame image scan and the flash, and if I go back to that single frame, you see the flash is exposing all of the frame. That means the readout takes place at one time of all the lines you have of the sensor. And there are significant shots that might suffer from a rolling shutter, and some of them you probably don't see them at all. You remember the movie you saw yesterday morning in the car? There are vibrations, and the vibrations look different than on a film camera. Have you realized that? I mean, I was sitting pretty close, that's maybe why I saw it. The vibrations of the camera mounted to the car, high frequency vibrations, they don't go, the old image go like that. It's like they do a little shake, and that's because of the rolling shutter of the camera that was used. It's not, I don't want to blame that at all, it's just, you can see that if you look for it, And of course, it's always a compromise. You have to find. This is a small camera they used, so they knew about it, and they appreciated the small size of the camera to do that shot on the car. But also like flashes, gunfire, fast pans, you will see results of rolling shutter. And there was another test done a couple of years ago by a company from the US. They used an F-35, which is a CCD-based camera, and they have a dish which is turning around, just spinning, and on the dish there are just white lines. Lines means straight lines. And they synchronized the sensor to the speed of the dish, or the speed of the dish to the sensor, so you can see an image like that if you have a global shutter camera. If you take another camera, and I don't want to blame that specific model, it's just I want to visualize that there is a significant difference. That happens to a straight line. And if you watch the news and you see a helicopter approaching at the emergency series you probably like to watch, usually it doesn't look like a helicopter. It now looks like a UFO, because the rotor blades of the helicopter look like that. So I like to demonstrate that why there is a difference in price between the cameras, because it's of course more difficult to make a sensor that avoids that. Any questions on that? Or is it something you already knew and it's pretty boring anyway? Let me know.
Do you have a F5 rolling shutter so we can see? I mean, you show us the 5D, you show us the other camera.
Yeah.
Do you have an image of the F5 to see the rolling shutter effect of the F5?
Unfortunately, I don't have that spinning disc. I would love to have showed it to you, and of course it will look a lot better. Also, if you use a Canon or an Arri or even all the other Sony cameras, they look a lot better than that. It's just an example of what happens. I tried to compare F5 with F55. This is my little flashy experiment. It was a bit, weak. I don't have the right tools, but I just tried to explain the principles of it. So I don't have a better example, I'm sorry. So, coming to the point of that you're cinematographers, at least I assume, or you're upcoming cinematographers, usually you don't want to mess around with electronics a lot. And when I started with digital cinematography, it was part of my job to take care of all the menus and settings, and due to the lack of, let's say, technology these days, there was a lot of tweaking going on to make it look good. Because the imagers were not perfect, the dynamic range was limited, and so you had to have a different setup for, let's say, a low light setup or a high key situation. So if you wanted to use an electronic camera efficiently, you were tweaking a lot. And if you didn't, it looked different. It's not bad, but it looked different. And also there was such a thing as a Sony look to the images, because the images were processed in the camera, and then they were recorded, and then you already burned in a certain look, which was created by Japanese engineers, and you liked it or not. That changed. It changed in several meanings. One is that the sensors now have a great dynamic range. So exposure with the 14 stops latitude of any camera, it's more forgiving to not perfectly catch it on the sweet spot than a camera that is only able to do 5 or 8 stops. That's the first part. The second part is, since you're able to record RAW or the logarithmic processed versions, you don't necessarily decide to go for a Sony look. You just try to capture what the sensor is giving you at a given time. And that means there is no such a thing as a Sony look anymore. Sony cameras can look as you like them to look. So I really want to point that out. It gives you, and that's actually I think from a Sony point of view, that's something new, still new, to give you full control about the images. They like to have it a bit more in control of their engineer side, and they think what is good for you, but some of you probably didn't like it. Now they give you all the freedom to shoot, and then choose the look you want to have later in the post-production, like you would have done it in film or with other digital cameras. And to do that, there's very little menus necessary. If you look at the cameras, they do have menus. They are simplified, and if you like to fiddle with the menus, you're a geeky nerd, you can play with the menus as much as you want. So you still have the possibilities, but you don't have to. So if you just want to shoot a movie in a cinematic approach, that's why I say I try to explain a bit about the cinematic approach. Just a little setup necessary, like on every digital camera, and then it records sensor data, and you pick later how you want to have it look like. So how does it work? It looks more complicated than it is, but basically you have a project setting, which is generated by your frame rate. Let's say you shoot cinema, it's probably 24 frames a second, or if you shoot TV, it's 25, project frame rate. And there is a general operation mode now in the cameras, which is called a Cine AI mode or a custom mode. So if you go Cine AI, most of the menus turn gray. So you don't even have to, you don't have access to it. So it cuts like 7 out of 10 menus just by switching that little step to Cine AI. Also it enables raw recording if you consider recording the raw. So raw recording is kind of locked to the Cine AI mode. If you're not shooting raw, because you want to have a compact camera, or you don't have the budget, or you don't have the recorder, you can choose the onboard recording, and then you of course have to pick one of the options. I explained that a bit more detail. And then if you want to have the cinematic approach, automatically it defaults to a logarithmic recording. It's called S-Log2. That's the SONY logarithmic recording. There are now 2 flavors, but I don't want to go into much details. And then if you do high speed, of course you do your high speed settings, but if you do regular speed, you're already set up the base setting of the camera. It's that easy. And then on top of it, you only do your operational things, like shutter speed, white balance, you configure your video outs. If you use audio, how do you want to record audio? It's very basic, like on every other camera in that domain as well. Because people think it's complicated, it's not really. Try it. And what is EI? So there is the Cine EI. So EI stands for exposure index. So even the language the camera is trying to talk to you, or you trying to talk with the camera, is now film language. So there's an ISO value, or actually it's not really ISO, it's exposure index, which you know from the ISO rating of film stocks. So let's say if you're in Cine AI on an F55, the display tells you it's 1250 ASA, so you can set your light meter to that. And it also gives you an indication of your latitude. It says 6.0 E. I don't know why it's called E, but it gives you an indication that from your middle gray, your good old 18% gray card, you have 6 stops until the sensor clips, and probably 6 or 7, maybe even more, to the shadows. And if you change your ISO rating, that changes as well. So at every point you change settings on the camera, and it's just a very basic adjustment you do, like you want to have it a bit more sensitive for that shot or less sensitive for the other shot. That dynamic range information changed. So if you want to use your light meter, you can. It's even at Sony cameras now you can use your light meter very easily. And that's like a film emulsion. So you do some exposure tests, and I tested it with just my spot meter and the 18% gray card, and it matches really almost dead on to that 6 stops to the clipping value in the F55, for example. It also works on the F5, of course, and it's the same on the F65. So there's very little engineering knowledge necessary to run the camera like that, in that mode at least.